It's the Religious Studies Project. It is now Monday, the 13th of May, or you might be listening to this at some point way in the future, and this could be some sort of strange artifact from a previous civilization that no longer exists.
Indeed. It's not the 13th when we're saying this. It's probably not the 13th when you're listening, but in some abstract sense, this is the episode for the 13th of May.
It is. That voice belongs to David Robertson. My voice belongs to me. And David has been speaking with
presuming that
Hayes.
we're still alive in this model, given that civilization's gone and all that's left is these recordings. The voice maybe doesn't belong to us anymore if we don't exist. This interview is with me and Matthew Hayes
on Buddhism in the Critical Classroom. Take it away, David.
Well, I'm pleased to be speaking today to Matthew Hayes, who is a research student at UCLA. That's the University of California in Los Angeles. Welcome to the RSP, Matthew.
David, thank you very much. Very happy to be speaking with you. I appreciate it.
You're very welcome. You got in contact with what I think is a really interesting topic, something very RSP, combining our loves of pedagogy and critical theory. And you wanted to talk about critical pedagogy in teaching non-Western religions. So maybe we could kick off just a little bit of context as to who you are and what you do, and then we can get into talking about the course and the specific kind of exercises and stuff that you do.
Sure. Yeah, so my research kind of broadly is centered on Buddhist ritual practice during the early modern period in Japan, which runs from 1603 to 1868, and I'm interested really in issues of ritual knowledge production and transmission, the formation and sort of dissolution also of social groups in this context. I focus on a genre of devotional liturgy called koshiki, and my dissertation actually takes a fairly narrow look at one specific koshiki written by a medieval monk named Kakuban. And the research really traces later performative, editorial, and even pedagogical iterations of this koshiki, and really argues that these iterations served as kind of vectors for the transmission of religious knowledge at a specific temple called Chishakuin in Kyoto during the 17th century or late 17th century. So my research is really a kind of mix, I suppose, of kind of an institutional study, it's a textual study, it's a social study, it's a ritual study. So it's a kind of hybrid project in that way.
It's quite a good technique, I think, actually doing that sort of critical reading of changes in the text. It could be very enlightening as to the, from a critical point of view, as to the way that texts are interpreted and the way, in relation to their context over time, of course.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's, I think, fairly common to take ritual performance as a performance. And so I'm trying to tread this line between performance and a textual study, sort of what happens when we look at a ritual text as a text. Because in a lot of ways, not only the ritual text, but actually commentarial literature surrounding this text was taken up as a kind of textual study by monks themselves. So it sort of straddles this line between performance and a kind of more cognitive study of a text.
Cool. Now, question always comes down to, in the classroom, how do we start? So you had quite an interesting exercise that you started with.
Right. Yeah. So I teach fairly regularly here at UCLA. I teach an Introduction to Buddhism course, which is, a broad survey course, usually fairly highly enrolled, anywhere between 60 and 100 students. It's a GE course, which means students are required to take it to graduate. So there's a fairly heavy writing component to this course. One of the kind of early assignments that I give students is a kind of, it's almost a throwaway assignment, right? It's a kind of it's a way to sort of gauge base level writing skills. It's very low stakes. It's not worth very much compared to later kind of research projects. But what it really does, I think, for me anyway, is it unearths a lot of assumptions about Buddhism as a religion in the minds of students. So the assignment actually asks students to take a stance without any prior knowledge of the tradition. This is day one of the course, essentially, or week one, and make an argument for Buddhism as either a religion or a philosophy, right? So this is it's kind of a foil for me, or kind of a straw man, right? Something to kind of set up assertion, sort of assumptions, pre-existing knowledge, if any, about the tradition, which is then later kind of either refined or displaced over the weeks as the course goes on. And so, yeah, that's essentially the assignment. It allows students to kind of express whatever they can, if they can, about Buddhism as a kind of template of sorts that'll be kind of reworked and reformed as the course goes on in their writing.
Yeah, it's an interesting, I've done similar ones, but I've never done that exercise focused specifically on Buddhism. The fact that you do is interesting, because I think you would get different answers depending on which tradition you were asking, I think.
Right, absolutely, right. So that's the other kind of component, and it's meant to be broad, right? It's meant to kind of that's another one of the kind of straw men that I'm setting up for students, right? The course, of course, culminates after a number of weeks, and we discuss this issue of kind of multiplicity or plural Buddhisms, right? That kind of populate the world, and of course, to sort of set up this assignment as Buddhism in the singular, as if it's a kind of monolithic tradition, already is a kind of trap for students, right? So they sort of fall into this idea that there's this kind of uniform practice, right? A uniform kind of doctrine and uniform kind of engagement by adherents across the world, right? This is another thing for me to kind of slowly break down across the course. So, framing it in that way is kind of meaningful and sort of utilitarian for me, right? It's something that I can sort of leverage across the weeks.
Absolutely. And students, they'll go into the classroom. I think they're more likely to have ideas about Buddhism going into Religion 101 than they are about, Sikhism or Buddhism. Seems to be, and this is certainly the case in the UK context, seems to be the next one that you look at. If you've been raised in Christian or post-Christian context, and I don't know how it works with Judaism, but it seems to be the one that the teenager will then look at next in their interest in different religions. And so I find that students arrive with ideas about Buddhism already.
Absolutely. I find the same to be the case here in the United States, or at least in Los Angeles. A lot of that information, I think, is coming in from sort of popular culture, right? Buddhism in many ways has sort of found its place in sort of mainstream culture and popular culture. We have the Zen of fill in the blank, right? All of these kind of various transmutations of the tradition for various purposes. And so students are, exposed to this all the time, whether they sort of recognize it or not. And so another exercise I do at the very beginning, day one, is just to kind of poll the class. What is Buddhism? What do you think of when I say the word Buddhism? And of course, the answers kind of range, but predominantly you see a lot of stuff reflected in that same pop culture, right? A sort of a monk or a mendicant sitting in a robe, doing nothing but meditating all day, giving up possessions, and so on and so forth, right? Not necessarily incorrect, but it's a fairly kind of categorical view of Buddhism, right, as a kind of monolithic practice. So they do come in with something, right?
And asking students to talk about Buddhism, and I think especially in framing it as a question of, religion or philosophy, these kind of questions, this allows you to recognize what you're calling a sort of cultural language, ways of talking about these things that the students are bringing into the classroom. Is that right?
That's right. Yeah. So, when I poll the class, and certainly in this first writing assignment, which asks them to kind of take a stance on what Buddhism is, or what they think it is, inevitably, and this of course isn't across every single student, but predominantly across the class, I see a sort of common language being used in the classroom, and then of course in this first assignment. So to talk about, or to kind of get at what they think is a sort of the kind of ethical aspects of Buddhism, right, prior to their understanding that gets kind of worked and developed across the class, they'll use words like sin, right? And their kind of conception of Buddhism as a kind of quote unquote godless religion, they might use a kind of a term like atheism to describe this. Similarly, in their kind of efforts to get at this idea of rebirth or a kind of cycle of kind of being reborn back into the world, they'll use words like afterlife, right? There's sort of maybe 10 or 12 or 15 of these terms that seem to come up during this first week or two of class. And so this, to me, was very compelling, predominantly because it seemed to be fairly uniform, right, across a lot of these responses. And so, during the first few years of teaching, I mean, just a few short years ago, I began teaching and thinking about what the kind of implications are here, right? What does it mean to think about this sort of set of ideas and ideals and concepts and terms that students bring into the classroom that are kind of wielded in trying to define something otherwise foreign to them or unfamiliar to them, or something that is ill-defined, at least from day one. So, cultural language. I mean, there certainly could be a kind of a better term. Certainly there's probably a theorist out there who's worked through some of this stuff a bit more kind of accurately than I have. But yeah, a cultural language or a kind of a cultural location, right, from which they appraise a religion that is unfamiliar, something like this.
It'll work for our purposes today, at least. Yeah. So the question that you raised is talking about what we do with these then in the classroom,
right?
And you set out a few sort of strategies, which I'd quite like you to sort of describe each of them in turn, because it's quite interesting, and I have a few reflections on some of these as well. Whether we start with that now, or we go a little bit more into what we're trying to do in the classroom first and foremost, what do you think?
Yeah, maybe we could talk a little bit about this first. I mean, just sort of what we do with these sets of terms, if that's okay.
Yeah, absolutely. It seemed like it came down to the question really of what we're trying to do in the classroom in this, sort of introductory course. Are we, as the sort of, the early sort of anthropologists were doing, are we translating unfamiliar terms into familiar terms?
Right.
Or are we doing something that is more destabilizing? Are we challenging the terms that they're using? I think it comes down to what it is that we're trying to do. And I wanted to ask you what you think you're trying to do. That sounds
sure.
Sounds more aggressive than I meant it. But.
Sure. No. Yeah. So I mean, I don't want to take a kind of a complete position here, but I would say what I try to do class to class is probably somewhere in between those two approaches, right? So, I was an undergrad once, of course, and have been in classrooms that took the approach of kind of immediately kind of discarding whatever terms or understandings or positions are brought into the classroom and working to kind of break bad habits, as it were, right? Try to kind of replace these terms with something a bit more in-house or something a bit more accurate or specific to the tradition that's being studied. And I think that's fair, but from a kind of practical perspective, and I was one of these students, it can sort of scare them off a bit, right? It can it can be sort of paralyzing once that sure footing is kind of removed, right, or kind of pulled out from underneath the student. And of course, there may be some educators out there who say, well, we must kind of shock them into this kind of mode of critical inquiry, right, shedding a lot of these bad predispositions and habits and replacing them with ones that are that speak more truthfully or accurately to the object under study. I think that's fair. For me, again, I sort of fall somewhere in between those two poles. So on the one hand, I do not by any means want to simply adopt these terms that students bring into the classroom and sort of use them interchangeably, right? That's very kind of dangerous and risky, and I think does a real kind of disservice to whatever is trying to be done in the classroom for the educator. I also don't think they should be sort of left at the door either. And so allowing students, at least in the initial stages, to kind of use familiar footing or use familiar language in ways that allow them to kind of get at an issue or speak to a concept or describe something, some practice or facet of doctrine, I think can be very, very helpful. And then slowly, as the class goes on, you begin to kind of replace, right, or kind of displace those terms with something else. So just to give a kind of brief example, you might have students at the beginning of the course, using left and right this term sin, right? Describing it in the context of Buddhism, however they sort of deem necessary. And slowly, you might either in paper revisions or in the classroom verbally, you might begin to kind of introduce a softer term, right, or a kind of related term like transgression, which I think is more kind of categorical. It's more broad. It's not even necessarily Buddhist, right? But it is less kind of Judeo-Christian, right? It sort of distances itself from that initial position. And then as things even proceed sort of further, you might introduce something a bit more in the realm of Buddhism, something like unwholesome action, right? Or an action that sort of accrues karmic retribution. A bit more kind of technically Buddhist and certainly a bit more accurate. And so in that way, by introducing these kind of in-between terms like transgression that kind of bridge that initial position to, what we hope to kind of develop as a kind of later position for students, which is really a kind of clear and accurate view of the Buddhist tradition in 10 weeks as best we can in a survey course. There are kind of, I think, rhetorical strategies in the classroom and certainly strategies that can be deployed on paper, revising papers and such that can really kind of steer students in a more natural way toward proper usage, accurate usage, and sort of precise usage of these terms.
Sorry to interrupt the episode, but we just wanted to let you know, to remind you about our Patreon link. The Religious Studies Project has always been free since its inception, but we know that there's a great problem in academia with people not being paid for the work that they're expected to do, particularly early career scholars. And we at the RSP want to be part of the solution, not part of the problem. So you can help if you can spare even £1 a month by going to patreon.com/Project RS and subscribing. We know that these podcasts are very useful for people who are teaching and people in their learning. So if you can help either by subscribing there or by making a one-off donation using the PayPal button on our website, it'd be greatly appreciated and will help us keep bringing you this podcast for free and fight against exploitation in academia. But now, back to the episode.
The language that is used is so tied up with histories of, social histories of the use of terms. It can be a very difficult task to upset, associations of, say, karma and sin and these kind of ideas. There is a sort of, it's often tied up with calls to decolonize the university and things, which is something I have some sympathy with, but I do also question the degree to which the university as we know it, the Western tradition of the university, how far we can actually go with actually not being there to translate one alien data language into a familiar data language. I think there are ways to start doing it, as you say, to find a middle ground, but I do think that we more or less always inevitably end up at doing that. The same comparative history of religions has always been.
Yeah, it's difficult. I mean, ultimately, we're in a kind of Western classroom under the guise of kind of Western administration, right? Which of course falls underneath this broader kind of category of sort of kind of Western perspective, and if you want to take a critical view of sort of Western dominance, right? And so you're absolutely right. There's a kind of difficulty there in being aware as an educator of where some of this language is coming from, where the predispositions of students are coming from, and certainly where our own predispositions are coming from as educators trying to kind of mediate for students. And it becomes a kind of real challenge to think that we can kind of solve the problem, right? Or kind of completely do away with some of those underlying, as you say, sort of colonial values or sort of issues of dominance or invasion and so on and so forth. And I think, you mentioned critical pedagogy at the start. I think someone like Ira Shore, who really is kind of championing just a basic awareness, right, of this as educators, right? Just a kind of awareness of this issue of dominance that kind of bubbles beneath the surface of learning processes and pedagogical processes, I think is really the key here. So while we may not kind of be able to save the day, right, in the end, or really kind of play that role to its full extent, especially in a 10-week survey course, right, where it's very, very difficult to kind of have a kind of long-lasting effect on students in that kind of deep way that I think people like Ira Shore and others are kind of speaking to. A kind of basic awareness of this problem, I think, can go a long way for sure.
I haven't read Shore's work, so that's a great lead for me to follow up. I mean, I'm thinking specifically in the way that Russell McCutcheon teaches. There's a deeper issue within the field that no matter what language we use, whether we're sort of successfully translating or we're using our own categories or whatever we are doing there, we are still operating within the Western category of religion. And if we were able to translate those terms into their own language, we're still by dint of talking about religion. And it's not something that we can escape. I don't think it's part and parcel with the way that the subject is set up.
Absolutely. I mean, that's the problem with sort of teaching in a discipline that's so, I think, acutely defined, right? As much as we want to talk, especially now, about these issues of sort of fluidity, right? And kind of dynamism, trans-sectarianism, trans-religious dialogue, a lot of these kind of things that tend to sort of blur the lines between this tradition and that tradition, or that sort of gesture toward shared similarities between the two. You're absolutely right. I mean, ultimately, we are teaching within a discipline, through a discipline, and kind of by the guidelines of that discipline, right? You're absolutely right. I think that's a real kind of challenge as well.
I think it's a deep challenge, and I think it's I don't know if it's unique to your religious studies, but it's certainly acute. In some ways, it seems a bit of a Gordian knot. So I'm surprised you're saying that you position yourself in the middle. I don't know where else we could, really. And that's kind of why I was asking, what is it that we're doing in that introductory class? Because I'm not entirely sure myself in that introductory class, except personally go the more sort of deconstructive route, I guess. But then I'm not starting with Buddhism. I start with new religions usually. And I think that there are some ways in which it's easier. So my aim is not particularly to get people to understand new religions. It's more to try and get them to think anew about their own traditions and what they have taken for granted as being sort of rational, normal, or unexpected. And by showing them people who are very much like them, who do things that they are supposedly crazy or at least stigmatized, that we can start getting them to think about the reasons for their own actions and their own beliefs and things, and to sort of break down the category a little bit and start saying, oh, actually, this isn't as straightforward a thing as I thought it was. But I guess coming from Buddhism is a completely different ballgame.
It's difficult. Yeah. I mean, you look at a tradition like Buddhism, with a much longer sort of sociocultural history, than something like a new religion, right? So, there's a kind of, I think, some time has to be spent at least kind of doing the historical work to sort of flesh that out. Students need a kind of a broader context, right? So, when I teach this course, we begin in India and we go all the way up to the modern West, which in 10 weeks is just crazy, to think that we can really do any kind of service to any of those traditions or sort of sub-traditions that grew out across those regions. And so in a way, I do sometimes feel like a slave to that mode of pedagogy, right? Having to do a lot of this kind of early historical background, and certainly, we spend some time with major figures, and I do my best certainly to bring out some of these broader kind of critical issues, issues of kind of, what it means to practice, what is a practice, what it means to sort of engage with a religion. Some of those ideas that students bring into the classroom are immediately sort of deconstructed for them, right? We talk actually at length in my class about a lot of scandals that have occupied the Buddhist world, not only in recent times, but in the past as well. So a lot of this kind of confrontational teaching, right, or teaching that aims to kind of break students of what might otherwise be a kind of ideal image of Buddhism in their minds when they come into the classroom. A lot of that is at work, but just the age of Buddhism, right? It is a very, very old tradition. So there's some sort of responsibility, I think, I have to take there in sort of playing the setup, right, doing the kind of long setup. Yeah,
absolutely. So let's talk for the last few minutes then about how we can use this assumption of familiar language or a cultural language, however we want to call it, how we can use that to our pedagogical advantage. Different strategies that we can use to build a language of familiarity we've already talked about, but how we can use it to really enhance the students' learning.
Yeah, again, I think this idea from Shore, who really kind of pushes a kind of awareness or at least attention to one's biases, and not in a kind of self-critical way, but in a kind of positive way, right? We're meant to kind of confront these biases, confront our cultural positions or our locations, and I think, in his view, ultimately leverage them in the name of transcending them, at least momentarily, right? Transcending them for 10 weeks in a survey course, where we might adopt a more kind of accurate set of positions or set of terms that allow us kind of faithfully to the tradition. In terms of tactics, I will just confront this predisposition front and center in the classroom, and so in a way, my job, I've always envisioned as a kind of educator, is to be a collaborative learner, right? And a collaborative teacher. And so rather than taking this kind of unidirectional approach and keeping this issue of predispositions and maybe dominant culture in my mind, I'll simply put it out there for the entire class to kind of wrangle with and deal with. And so once it's out there on the table, we can all together be aware, as Shore says, or be kind of cognizant of our own biases. And that allows us to kind of use them positively, use those biases in ways that help to kind of better either clarify or better define or better utilize terms that are otherwise foreign or kind of murky for students. Yeah, I think sort of, keeping, a lot of those sort of institutional biases or cultural biases or religious biases secret as a teacher is kind of a disservice to students, right? I mean, that sounds to me like, one of the things you might even be doing in your class in new religions is sort of building a kind of awareness of habits, right? Or kind of awareness of preconceptions of what it means to be religious or do religious practice or something like this.
Right, absolutely. Yeah, I often start the class actually. It used to be, I used to have a block that was in a sort of World Religions 101, and I was basically you had the 5 world religions, right? And then I was 6. I was the other stuff.
Right.
And I used to start by asking them, okay, so you've had 5 religions. Have you been told what a religion is?
Right.
And they of course hadn't been at any point. I quite often will point out to students, look at, if you want to know what hegemony is in terms of religions, what gets counted as a religion, look at the courses you've done, and they'll think back to first year and go, all right, yeah, it's the same 5 things over and over again. And if you get something else, it's stuck in as an extra, it's
right.
And always with a qualifier, it's indigenous religions, or it's new religions, or it's religious movements, or, there's some term that distances it.
Right.
So yeah, we talked about this in the book that I edited with Chris Cotter. Actually, we called it sort of subversive pedagogies, in terms of where you have to work within that particular setup, in the university, the world religions and these kind of things.
Right. And I was just very quick. Yeah, go ahead.
I was just finishing to say you can use it to your advantage.
The nice thing about sort of this issue is it's not, at least in recent years, hasn't been such a kind of mystery. I mean, there's some scholars out there who are actually writing on this issue of, what it means to do religious studies in academia, what it means to try to kind of de-institutionalize, or even in some cases de-colonize, as you say, the university. I'm thinking of like Tomoko Masuzawa, The Invention of World Religions, right? So she really does a nice job of pointing directly at academia, at the institution itself, as a kind of, put it critically, a kind of culprit, right? In putting together what we now conceive of as quote unquote world religions, right? I mean, I thought of that when you said, there were the sort of the first 5 and then you as the 6th. It seems that this idea of a kind of inclusive, exclusive, grouping model, or sort of this idea that there could be outliers to, a quote unquote pantheon of religion, is not totally disconnected from the work that academics are doing, right? And in a lot of ways, I think, again, people like Shore and others are kind of pointing back at instructors and teachers as people who can sort of reorient the model or sort of reconceptualize the model as sort of not so, categorical or exclusive or inclusive.
Right, yeah, and one of Tomoko's point, and Russell McCutcheon makes the same point, Tim Fitzgerald makes the same point, is that actually in teaching that way and presenting these things, in fact, we're constructing that model and that worldview that the students then bring into the classroom. So one thing that's quite interesting, when you described the exercise, is Buddhism a religion or a philosophy, is that we can use that in a discussion afterwards to ask, well, what does it matter? what's at stake.
Right.
If we say that Buddhism is a religion, or if we say it's a philosophy, what's at stake there? What practical effect does that have? I mean, you could connect the use of philosophy there with the fact that atheism and stuff is coming up there, and gain a real insight there into the way that the term religion is being mobilized in the milieu that the students exist in. So you're no longer talking about 2,500 years Buddhist tradition and several continents or whatever. You're talking about the specific way that religion is being mobilized for the students in their own world.
Absolutely. I mean, these are the students who will go on to have, hopefully a lengthy conversation, but in reality, probably a 30-second conversation with their friends, about Buddhism. The word comes up, or they see something on TV or whatever, and, they might spout off a few lines about how they conceive of the tradition after having taken the class. And so, the stakes are there, and sort of how we position the tradition in relation to, the students and their own learning process, but also how we position the tradition in relation to the kind of broader categorical and institutional frameworks that I think have dominated for so long. Absolutely.
So it's a very simple example of how we can flip from the students' expectations that they're coming into the classroom to be told facts and very flip it until, so now we're talking about how ideas and how knowledge is constructed. That's what I think we're there in the classroom to do.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it's sort of a reflexive approach, I think, is really, really helpful.
Absolutely. Matthew Hayes, thanks for coming on the RSP. It's been a really interesting conversation. I'm sorry that we've run out of time.
It's quite all right. Thank you so much, David. I really appreciate it. It's been very enjoyable.
Well, that esoteric chat at the beginning of the podcast was maybe quite apt for a podcast on that stereotypical thing that is definitely not a religion, Buddhism.
Yes, it's a philosophy, as we all know. Yeah, we've got next week's interview is
another one by Maria Alexeyevskaya.
It's with Anna Salonen. Yeah. I hope I've pronounced that properly.
Picking up quite directly from an interview that we did with Michel Desjardins back in the first year, I think, of the RSP, which is on religion and food. So this one takes that sort of maybe more theoretical, methodological podcast and ties it into some sort of like a particular empirical case study looking at food banks and that sort of thing. So,
and the way that these kind of issues of values and ethics are built into discourses about food and waste and the rest of it.
And good religion and bad religion. And,
Indeed.
And all of that.
Indeed.
So we look forward to that. That's Maria's, I think it's her second interview for us.
I believe so.
Yeah. So
thanks. She was one of the new interviewers who joined last year, and we'll be making a push for new interviewers, editors, audio people, all sorts of things to join. We'll probably launch that in a week or two's time, but just bear that in mind. It's a great way to bolster your CV in this increasingly competitive job market.
Yeah.
As you'll remember from our interview with Russell a couple of weeks ago.
See, it's like a sort of finely woven tapestry, an audio tapestry.
An audio tapestry from a civilization which no longer exists. Who's even saying this?
If an RSP podcast is dropped online and receives no listeners, does it exist?
Thanks for listening, we hope.
The RSP is sponsored by the British Association for the Study of Religions, the North American Association for the Study of Religion, and the International Association for the History of Religions. The Religious Studies Project is produced by the Religious Studies Project Association, SCIO, a Scottish charitable incorporated organisation, charity number SC047750.
Brought to you by founders and editors-in-chief Chris Cotter and David Robertson, and managing editor Thomas J. Coleman III. Our features are edited by Marek Sullivan and Rebecca Barrett-Fox, and our Opportunities Digest by Ella Bock. Podcast transcription by Helen Bradstock, with audio editing by Gregory Schneider and Samuel Ward. Social media managed by Ray Radford, sales and marketing by Sammy Bishop, and video editing by Jonathan Tuckett. Don't forget you can support the project by using our amazon.com, .co.uk and .ca links, or donating at patreon.com/projectrs, and you can find us on Facebook, Twitter, Google+, YouTube, iTunes and other portals.